Hey y'all, so in this video tutorial, I'm teaching you how to make this pillowcase for a toddler-sized or travel-sized pillow form. Now, I'm gonna put the link for the ones that I have here in the description box below. These pillow forms measure 13 inches by 18, so they're the smaller sized ones. And so we're gonna be going through step by step how you can make this one. Now, one quick note, we are going to be using a regular home sewing machine for this, but we don't have any raw edges. The whole thing is completely finished on the inside. We're going to be using French seams to fully finish everything off. You see there's no raw edges on the inside. And I'm also going to show you how to do it burrito style, which I've done a tutorial on for a regular standard size pillow. You can do a search for that, or we'll put the link for you below also. So let's move this stuff out of the way. Let's pull out our supplies and get right to it. Now, I'll be using 100% quilting cotton fabrics, and I'm using 3 different prints, one for the body, one fabric for this accent piece, and nice to have a contrasting band here for a little pop of color, and then a 3rd fabric for the cuff. So I have the 3 fabrics I'm going to be working with here. This will be the body, this will be the accent strip, and this one will be the cuff. Okay, go ahead and select your fabrics, and then I'm going to bring out some of the other supplies I recommend you gather. Now, aside from a sewing machine that works, you're going to need something to measure, like these rulers, something to cut your fabric. I'll be using a rotary cutter and the cutting mat that's on my table here. And then for this project, I like to use both sewing pins and some plastic clips, and you'll see where I use each of these in the project. Some thread snips would be handy also, and of course, an iron and an ironing board so you can prep and press your fabrics. Okay, y'all, we're ready to cut. So the first cut is going to be for the main body of the pillowcase, and we need quite a big piece. So start off with about ½ yard of quilting cotton here, and we are going to cut this down to 15 inches, and then we'll subcut it again. So first I'm going to clean off a little bit off this edge just so I can make sure it's nice and straight. Then I'm going to measure over 15 inches this way. And for this project, it doesn't have to be super precise like in a quilt or something, so I'm just going to use the lines on my cutting mat here to save time. So 15 inches over is going to set me here. All right, so we have our 15 inches this way. Next is to cut the full strip down to 35 inches, okay? And this is longer than that. So I'm gonna keep mine folded up just so I can make one cut and go through both layers. And so if I need 35 inches in length and I have a fold right here, I know that I can cut it in half, and when I open the full strip, it'll be double that size, right? So 35 inches is the measurement I need. Half of 35 is 17.5. So if I position the fold here on one line, and I'm using, say, the 30-inch mark on my cutting mat, then I can go over this way 17.5 inches and cut, and that will give me the full 35-inch strip. So if I started at 30, 17.5 will put me here at 47.5. And I'll align my ruler right there and cut here. So these are 2 cut edges. These are leftover bits. Okay, you can save those for another project. But now when I open this up, I have the full 35-inch long piece that I need. 15 inches by 35 inches. All right, set it aside and go ahead and grab the second fabric. Next up, I'm cutting the little accent fabric, and for that we'll need 2 pieces that measure 2 inches by 15. So I'm just going to cut 2 strips here from my ½ yard chunk and then cut them down to the 15 inches I need. $15 inches is the length on all the pieces that you should have. Now for the cuff fabric, similarly, first we need to get rid of the selvage edge so we have a nice clean cut edge to work from. And then we're going to cut 2 chunks that measure 6 inches by the 15. So we need to subcut these guys down also. All right, let's subcut this down to the 15 inches that we need. All right, so let's audition how it's going to look. This is the body. This will be folded in half, so you'll see a little sliver of an accent piece there. And then this is going to be our cuff folded in half again. So it's going to be narrower like that. So this is what the finished pillowcase is going to look like. Now let's go ahead and grab an iron and an ironing board so we can start folding up our accent strip. Pretty side face down, and then you're going to fold in half, lengthwise, and press. If you have a clapper, use it because it'll help set that crease really nice and flat. Next, we open up the main body piece. So you just have one layer here. I'm going to turn it, and then I'm going to take one of these and position it so that the raw edges of the strip are lined up with the top raw edge also. So that's going to be like this, and I'm going to position some pins. Don't go overboard with the pins here because you're going to have to take them out and reinsert the next layer. So just put maybe 4 across, I think would be enough. Next, take one of the cuff pieces and position it pretty side facing down on top of the accent strip. So everything should still be 15 inches here, so everything should match up nicely. Now grab the pin that you just inserted, hold everything together, and notice where my fingers are. I basically straddle the pin with my fingers, one on each side. I will take out this pin, nothing has moved, and I will reinsert it now to catch the cuff fabric layer that we just added on top. So this is a helpful tip for ensuring everything stays where you want it to be. Take out the pin, reinsert. And you have to do this one more time, so make sure that you're still keeping everything nice and straight. If anything moves, just give it a little jiggle to get it back in place. All right, so this is the burrito method. All right, so we're just going to carefully flip that back a little, slide the whole long main fabric piece and start rolling it onto itself like this. Once you roll it up to the fabric, I want you to flip the cuff fabric down over top, and then we're going to flip the whole thing over like this, okay? So now notice you have this raw edge of the cuff. This needs to come over everything and be the 4th layer that you add to where those pins were. So a couple things is make sure that this is not in your way. If you need to bundle it even tighter, do that. You know, just make sure that none of this gets caught in here, but that you can still reach over top of the bundle with the cuff fabric, okay? So again, I'm going to bring that fabric over top, straddle the pin with my fingers, pull out the pin, reinsert. Make sure you got some strong pins, or you can change from pins at this point to some sewing clips so that you grab all 4 layers now that you have there. So bring it, make the raw edge meet up with the rest, and grab it with the pin. And then I'll go in and put a couple of sewing clips in between these pins just for some added insurance. And make sure that that bundle is further over than about a 1/2 inch or so. You don't want to catch it when we go to sew this. All right, so for sewing, I just have a universal size 80-12 sewing machine needle in my home sewing machine here. We do sell these machines in our shop currently, so you can check the link below for that. I'm using a 100% polyester all-purpose thread, which we also carry in our shop. It's my favorite for these types of easy little projects. And then we are going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And 3/8 of an inch for me is following the edge of the presser foot with the needle in the center position, and my stitch length is set to anywhere between 2 millimeters to 2.5. So 2.2 is my default, and that will work fine. So I'm going to start at the top, and I'll take a couple back stitches once I'm into the fabric. Put up my speed, and we're just going to sew all the way down. Make sure none of that bundle fabric gets in your way, so if you have to stop and move it, do that. Now, believe it or not, that one seam connected all that stuff, including attaching the cuff, folding it in half, and having it be finished on the inside. So now, To reveal all that, you gotta roll this out and pull all that main fabric out. And there you have it, all three connected and nice and finished on the inside. But of course, let's grab our iron. We need to give this a really good press, and then we'll just repeat the same steps here to the opposite end of the main fabric strip. So same steps. All right, so let's finish stitching up this pillowcase. So for French seams, we first need to sew it wrong sides touching. So ugly sides, meaning what's going to be on the inside matching, right? The way that it's going to look once it's finished, and we're going to sew this way. It might seem like we're doing it wrong, but trust me, French seams require 2 seams, and the first one needs to be sewn like this. So we're going to go here, match up the seam intersections, like where each of the 3 different fabrics match up so that we get some nice crisp intersections there, and place pins along the 2 raw straight edges. Remember that down here you don't have to do anything because it's on the fold of the fabric, so that's one less seam that you need to sew. Now we're going to stitch down both those sides that we just pinned using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And again, back stitch at the beginning and the ends to secure it. Now the next step is actually to trim down the seam allowance that we just sewed a little bit. So I had you sew 1/4 of an inch, and now we're going to shave down the seam allowances to 1/8 of an inch, mostly to get rid of all the little thread bits that are sticking out, and also the second purpose of trimming it down is so that it makes the seam allowance narrower. Some of you may be asking, well, why didn't we just sew 1/8 of an inch seam allowance? It's really tricky to sew super straight, especially for beginners on a basic project like this, at just 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So oftentimes you'll see instructions give you a larger seam allowance because that's easier to sew, and then you go in and trim it down, and that's what we're going to be doing here, okay? So I'm going to place my ruler on the seam allowance, and I'm just basically going to split the seam allowance in half. Make sure that you don't cut into your actual stitches, and just trim this down. You can also do this with scissors if that works for you better than the rotary cutter. So that's all I'm skimming off of it, okay? Other side. And this is going to ensure that the final seam of the French seam is nice and clean, and you don't have any threads or any bits of fabric poking through in the finished inside seams of the pillowcase. All right, so now we're going to flip the whole thing, wrong side out. And then you're going to pretend like you didn't sew this seam just now, and you're going to sew regularly with pretty sides touching. So poke out all your corners, make sure that those seams, you're going to have a nice straight edge to sew on. I'm going to give this a press first, and then we're going to stitch it up using a 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance if that's easier for you. If you left too much in the seam allowance, then you're going to have to sew a bigger seam allowance, because if you feel here on the side, you'll feel the seam allowance that we just trimmed down, and so you'll know that the seam allowance that you go to sew next needs to be bigger so that that little bit of raw seam allowance gets encased in the seam. All right, and that's kind of the anatomy of a French seam. Here's a tip I like to use this is just a bamboo knitting needle. You can use chopsticks, something that you can run in along the sides to poke out as much of that fabric as you can so that when we press it, it helps lie nice and flat for sewing. You don't want to have bubbled over seams because then the finished seam won't be straight and flat. So see the difference there in the one half that I did and the one half that I didn't. So this is what I mean by bubbling up. It's still pulling fabric to the inside, whereas here I can see the edge of the seam is running right along the side there. So do that along both sides and then we'll stitch it up. Now, if you went ahead and pressed it really, really good, you'll see that you don't even need pins or clips at this point. If you do need them in order to keep the side seam straight, feel free to put some in there, but I'm just gonna go ahead and stitch this up. Remembering that the seam allowance that I'm gonna sew here needs to be larger than what is on the inside. In other words, that seam allowance that we trimmed down is in here, and I want to now stitch from this side to close that up and catch it so none of those raw edges will peek through. Okay, so remember that. And so I'm going to go ahead and sew a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which for me is with the needle in the center position, because I know that the pillowcase is still going to be big enough to fit the 13 by 18 inch pillow form. All right, so I'm starting on one end, and we're going to back stitch at the beginning and end as usual. And then you can always stop and check and feel. My seam allowance is here and I can see where my needle is. I'm sewing bigger. I know it's going to turn out good. If you feel that the machine is stitching through some bulky layers, then that means you need to flip the whole thing out again, trim more off of that seam allowance, or sew a wider seam. And that's it. That is how we finish that off. Give everything a good press. We're going to flip it right side out and give it another press, and you'll see, one, that this is how the pillow is finished on the inside. There are no raw edges anywhere. So that's going to be the inside, and that is how we have those French seams. When we flip the whole thing right side out, you'll see that we also don't have any raw edges on the exterior of the pillowcase. Like this. If you go here into the side and you see some fabric creeping through or some threads, that means that either you didn't sew a large enough seam allowance in the last step we just did, or you didn't trim away enough from the first seam allowance that we sewed along these side seams, okay? And then on the sides, you should have the fabrics intersecting perfectly like that if you took your time to go ahead and match those intersecting seams. I know I didn't do a great job fussy cutting this strip, but this is just a tutorial and a sample, so you can do better than me if you're wanting to get these little images to be like right in the center. You could just leave this accent band off as well, or you can use a solid or a non-directional print. This print happened to have these kind of little motifs here sprinkled throughout, so it just ended up that that's where they fell. But no big deal. Give everything a really good press, and then we'll slip the pillow form inside of it so you can see how the whole thing looks finished. All right, y'all, so there you have it. That is a burrito style pillowcase tutorial for a travel or toddler size pillow form, which is 13 by 18 inches. If you enjoyed this video tutorial, please give it a thumbs up. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future tutorials. Here's another one that I also whipped up with the same fabric collection. These are a lot of fun to make, and they're great for kids and also for adults who are traveling, road trips, for the car, summer camp, all that kind of stuff. I'll also include a link in the description box below, or my Amazon affiliate link for the pillow forms that I used. That way you'll know that they will fit nicely, just like I designed it to be for that size pillow form. Okay? Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye.